All right, so we're starting this second session uh, of our series, and I thank all of you for coming back for a second session, and some of you who are here who missed the first session. Hopefully, you can go back and look at the first session if you haven't had a chance, because this is sort of a like many teachings in our tradition, we're following a path that has steps. And so this teaching is, following in that tradition. Um, so then what I'd like to do now is go right into the session by us collectively as a group setting our motivation. We talked about how important is in our last session, so we won't talk about that. We'll just set our motivation. I'm going to give us something to listen to for just a moment. So we're not meditating, but we're trying to put ourselves in a special place for these next 90 minutes. So here is our words to help us set our motivation this morning. I am very fortunate to have a human life with an abundance of conducive conditions for spiritual practice, recognizing the many ways I depend on others, relatives, friends, those who provide me food and other necessities. I wish to use my life to benefit them and other beings in the world, and to avoid harming anyone. To fulfill this wish, I need to work on my mind, decreasing incorrect, negative mental states and increasing positive ones. And that is my purpose for attending today's session. May this be beneficial for myself and everyone else, and may it be a cause for me to attain enlightenment in order to help all beings in the best possible way. So, having set that motivation, try to hold that, as I talked about last week, try to hold that in your mind throughout this session. It's a good practice, even when you're attending a teaching, to practice mindfulness, that development of single pointed concentration and focus. So try to hold that in your mind. So, just to reorient us from last week's session, we're exploring in this series the text called The Three Principal Aspects of the Path by Tsongkapa. And we're following mainly the commentary by Pabongka Rinpoche that was translated by Geshe Losang Tharchen, also known as Ken Rinpoche. He was a teacher here in New Jersey, where I live, and was actually one of my first Dharma teachers. So I covered this basic information about the text and the contributors last session, so we're not going to repeat that today. So for the next 90 minutes, I'd like you to just reset your focus on some of the basics that we did bring into that first session that we had last week. So hold in your minds as best as possible that you're entering into what I call the jungle of exploring the inner world of your own mind. It's a jungle. Why do I use that word? Because it is in an unnatural state, which is wild, uh, uncontrolled, and as His Holiness the Dalai Lama calls it, untamed. And we talked extensively about that last week. So, relative to that talk about it, try to hold that in your mind. And why would we voluntarily enter this space, this jungle, if you will? Um, and the reason we do is um, we know that there is where we'll find the source of all our suffering, and more importantly, the cure to that suffering. So our goal in exploring and going on this expedition, if you will, of it going into the jungle of the mind, is to discover the methods available to us to tame this mind, this untamed mind, and in the process to ultimately discover and experience its pure, natural, untarnished state. In Buddhism, we call this one's Buddha nature, which we talked about last time as well. So we go armed into this exploration with correct knowledge of what we've already learned about what is in this jungle of the mind. And this is all part of what is laid out in the entire Buddhist path that we learn from Buddha Shakyamuni. And at its core, utilizing on this exploration, at its foundation, is having that awareness of the Four Noble Truths, which we discussed last week. But just to state them, because it's always good to refresh our minds, let me put my share screen on here. Okay. Those Four Noble Truths are the truth of suffering, the truth of the origins of suffering, which sufferings arise from causes and conditions, the cessation of suffering, that there's a possibility to reach a state where suffering ceases, actually ends, and then the path to end suffering, that there is a path for such such a goal. And again, each time that we enter this inner world of our minds, it's with one purpose, and this is according to His Holiness, and that's to tame it. And that's why I use the word jungle. And also last week I talked about having the courage in the prescriptive meditations that were given to work with our mind, the courage to actually do the very first step, which is developing mental focus. But on what? It's allowing yourself to gently um, look at look at your particular sufferings. It's okay, because I talked about the importance of knowing what they are. If you don't know what they are, you don't know what you're looking for. You don't know what you're hunting, so to speak, to stay with the jungle analogy. So it's very important. Um, and so we work, and then from there, we can work with the resources that are provided to us, which are these prescriptive meditations. And these prescriptive meditations are what we talked about last week, which we'll go into in a moment. Um, so this is what we have to refocus our mind on as we talk about this topic in the context of um, this particular text by Tsongkapa over the next 90 minutes. Think of yourself having that meditative courage that you are like a warrior. And I really mean that. And as we talk more today, you'll see why that's applicable. And not an ordinary warrior, but one that is of the highest order. The teachers tell us that what that really means is that we're taking the path that is beyond um, the delusions of suffering existence, and skillfully applying the antidote of wisdom. So, this is the highest order of being a warrior that you possibly can be. So, this is something to keep in mind as we go on this morning. I'd like you to think that way. The King of Prayers has a verse which reads as follows: Limitless is the extent of space, limitless is the number of sentient beings, and limitless are the karma and delusions of beings. Such are the limits of my aspirations. So this kind of goes hand in hand with what we talked about in terms of setting our motivation. And Master Shantideva, in his guide to the Bodhisattva's way of life, says, for as long as space endures, and for as long as living beings remain, until then, may I too abide to dispel the misery of the world. So this gets at that phrase of having meditative courage and the further phrase of being a warrior of the highest order. So our first endeavor is to enter this world of the mind, and we did that in the first session. And we discovered the first principal teaching of the Buddha's path in Mahayana practice, and that is the practice of renunciation. And further, that practice of renunciation is the foundation of all Buddhist practices. We talked about that Theravada practice, Mahayana practice, even Vajrayana practice. Without it, you cannot build the house of the path. So we talked all about that. And we discovered the real meaning of renunciation, which brings this freedom from suffering, the first essential ingredient to gain freedom from suffering. And that was that we understand that suffering takes place every moment in our mind, moment by moment. It's endless. Um, and that is the state of suffering existence. Remember, everything is taking place dependently arising as our mind being a partner in all those dependently arisings with others, with all phenomena. And this is the source of where moment by moment suffering comes from. And that's essentially the Buddha's first noble truth. And further, the source of that suffering that we discovered were, as His Holiness calls it, the delusions or the mental afflictions, which motivated by our actions of body, speech, and mind, um, that in turn um, causes every moment of our mind to take on the mistaken interaction with others, that dependently arising, and with all phenomena, and even within our own reflective self. And this is why we need to work on the mind, why it's said we need to work on the untamed mind, because that is what is giving us the ongoing experiences that are ripening for us now. So our goal is to come out of that first expedition into the jungle that we took last week with our minds clear and adding to that the ingredient of urgency, urgent purpose to actively work with our untamed state of mind to end suffering. And this is the first practice that is articulated in the three principal aspects of the path that Tsongkapa gives us in these 14 verses. And let me just put that back up on the screen for us too. By the way, at the beginning of this session, if you look at the chat, I included this document that we're looking at now. You can download it from the chat. And if you don't know how to do that, if you're a Luddite like me, you can just email me, as I mentioned last week, and I'd be happy to send it to you. I also included two meditations, which are the prescriptive antidote that accompanies renunciation, which we talked about last session. So this is where the work really needs to happen, where we really need to do that meditative work as warriors, having the courage to be able to actually look at our sufferings and then know what to do with them. And in the process of these verses, these first 5 verses that we went through, for those of you who weren't here last week, I included actually 3 different versions of the same work, just transcribed in a slightly different way in English. And that's what you see on the screen here if you're on video Zoom. And that's why you see each verse repeated 3 times. And the only reason for that is to show you the nuanced, subtle differences that come to us in these various English translations. They all essentially have the same meaning, but one of them might connect with you a little bit more. So I did it with purpose. And we've already been through the first 5, so we're not going to go through them again. But what I did say at the end of last session was that we would start this session after this refocus, which I'm just about finished with, to talk about these 2 prescriptive meditation practices that actually bring one to having an experience of what ends up in verse 5, which is the one that's on the screen, of having generated not just renunciation, but true renunciation or pure renunciation. And this means that we have developed that awareness of the first two noble truths, suffering and where suffering comes from, which is from our delusions and the karmic ripenings that occur from participating moment by moment in non-virtuous activities, and that we want to start to look at the true nature of things in a very clear and knowing way. That's the goal of taming the mind. The mind's natural state is clear and knowing, according to the Buddha's sutra in the Pali Canon. So this is important, to take these first prescriptive meditation practices and really gain this solid foundation of generating pure renunciation. So what we're going to do today is we are going to do a meditation. There's two different meditations that are associated with developing renunciation. One is meditation on death, and the other one is a meditation on impermanence. Today, we're going to do a meditation on impermanence, mostly because it's shorter, has great value. So, practically speaking, with the time we have today, then it makes most sense to do it in this session. To do the meditation on death in whole would take about 40 to 45 minutes. So it's kind of long. You can do that in parts because it actually has 9 parts. But we're not going to do that here. Rather, one of the attachments I sent out in the chat is this meditation that I'm only going to talk a little bit about today, but not do, and that's the meditation on death. The other one that's in the chat, we're going to actually do, the other document, which is the meditation on impermanence. So before we move on to the next section of these verses, we want to take time out and really understand what these meditations are really all about. So, although we're not going to do a death meditation today, I want to talk a little bit about the importance of it, so that as I sent it to you as one of the attachment, it maybe encourages you to do it, actually do it. So I always like to start with the most blunt statement that, and it's a generalization, but it's generally true, which is, why are we unable to accept death as calmly as we accept everything else? Um, you know, even when we see something very impermanent right in front of our eyes that we might have at any given time, like a bouquet of flowers. We know a few days later it's going to wilt and die, but we're totally fine with that. We're very accepting of that. But that's essentially what's happening with ourselves from the moment we're born. But we don't like to look at it again to make that point. So change, disintegration, death are natural, inevitable aspects of suffering existence. And Buddhism explains this sort of process-wise as a separation of the gross level of one's mind um, and body that happens at the time of death. The conventional self is talked about in Buddhism. This is what's passing, dependently arising as we live through a lifetime. Buddhism also says that what continues is our subtle mind, which comes from previous moments of mind since beginningless time, is the way Buddhists refer to it. We don't have to necessarily, for the purposes of this class, be accepting of that. It's not the focus of this, but it's to give you context for death and the importance of, in this meditation practice, of taking on an acute awareness of calmly and gently being okay with looking at these 9 points that are in the meditation about death, so that you could feel and develop a healthy not a morbid, but a healthy sense of urgency to do practices that could possibly actually not only reduce the delusions and mental afflictions, but arise in their place, um, their antidote, which are virtuous activities and virtuous occurrences of moment by moment experience in our mind. Um, and this is to be cherished, not just for like whatever we're looking about in the future, whatever our dogma or belief is spiritually about like continuing lives or whatever, but even maybe looking at it from the point of view of just what it can do for us in an improved living moment by moment in this life. We don't need to even take it any further than that because the effects of this meditation have this result. This is the kind of result. And you have it at your command potentially if you undertake them. So there's much discussion to talk about why that's even possible. And it has to do with this concept in Buddhism called emptiness. We're not going to talk too much about that. But even as it's applied to death meditation, I'm going to plant in your mind right now that when we get later on in this session, uh, possibly middle of next session or the last session, where we're talking about the third principal aspect of the path, which is emptiness, the wisdom of emptiness, you can apply it to this practice, this meditation practice. But here, that's not our focus. We're in an earlier stage of just trying to develop renunciation. So, in short, essentially, the 9 rounds, the 9-point practice is a practice that has 9 components, and the three there's 3 sections. In the first section, there's the meditations in 3 parts on the inevitability of death. And then next comes in the next 3 parts of the 9 come the uncertainty of the time of death. And then the last 3 are about the fact that only gaining insight, we could call it spiritual insight. I'm talking about inner awareness of what is present in one's mind and learning how to skillfully work with that. You can call that a spiritual practice. It's not that far-fetched to call it that. Only by working in this way, with these kinds of meditation practices, can it help you at the time of death. So, just outlining that for you, I hope that you could see, at least on the surface, and against the backdrop of what we discussed last week, that there's value. There's value to doing this kind of meditation practice. So this is something for you to think about. Um, but for this morning, before we move on to the second aspect of the path, uh, I told you we were going to do a meditation on impermanence. So that's what we're going to do this morning. A few introductory comments about this. Um, Everything in existence is impermanent, almost everything, um, changing all the time in terms of our cognitive perception, our ability to see and perceive conceptually what is happening with everything in existence. And that's the essence of this meditation, which we will experience as we move into doing it. Um, and then when you see this, we're going to explore everything from our inner self all the way to all of existence in this meditation and bearing witness to and affirming that everything is impermanent, right down to from the most deepest cellular level to the uh, farthest limits and even beyond of the universe. So everything is in motion, everything, and always fluctuating, and further, always coming into existence, existing for some time, and then going out of existence. Um, so that's something to hold in your mind as we go into the meditation and try to think about it in the context of your own life. That's what we're looking to see is that if that's true, that's what we're looking to try to establish and affirm in the meditation on emptiness. And remember that per our discussion last week, the main purpose in that is to ignite, to give a sense of urgency to the precious human life that we have, that we talked about last week, and the golden opportunity we have to be aware of our untamed mind and through the lens of validating the Four Noble Truths, do something. Do something to get on a spiritual path, to engage in ending suffering, in its place, creating happiness, peace, and other qualities that are much better and much more beneficial, not only to yourself, but all others. So that's the nature of our meditation. And so now we're actually going to do this guided meditation. So I'd like all of you to take a moment to further relax into yourself. You've been listening to me for a bit. Let's move into a comfortable seated position, or if you're on a meditation cushion, utilize a meditation position that you're used to taking. And if you're sitting in a chair, first have an awareness that both your feet are side by side and are firmly planted on the ground. If you're sitting, have an awareness that your sit bones are firmly planting you on Mother Earth. And with that, there's a connection that you imagine is made not only to Mother Earth, but to all sentient beings. And not all sentient beings in a state of suffering, but a state of natural purity. That pure space, unruffled by delusions and mental afflictions. And in that space of connectedness, interconnectedness with all others, feel the kinship, feel the presence of the common nature we all share, the true nature of stillness and peace, joy and happiness. And then take a few breaths, and with your breath, move gently from head to toe, one body part at a time, where you try to identify any tensions that might exist in your body. And as you breathe in, imagine your breath aiding you in grabbing that tension gently and exhaling it out into clear, open space. And do this for the next 6 breaths. And next, using your breath to stay focused, we stay and keep our mind focused on our body. Think of its many different parts: arms, legs, head, skin, blood, bones, nerves, and muscles. Examine them one by one. Gently probe them with your feelings. Contemplate the nature of these things, their substance, their texture, their shape and size. Be sensitive to the body at work, the movement that is going on in each moment, the ebb and flow of your breath, the beating of your heart, the flow of your blood, the energy of your nerve impulses. Take a few breaths to do that type of gentle focus scan. Now be aware of your body at an even more subtle level, its cellular structure, that it's entirely composed of living cells, moving about, reproducing, dying, and disintegrating. Allow yourself to have that gentle awareness that all of this is happening at the cellular structural level of your body and all of our bodies, all sentient beings' bodies, moving about, reproducing, dying, and disintegrating. Now turn your attention to your mind. It too is composed of countless parts, thoughts, perceptions, feelings, following one after the other, ceaselessly. Simply watch this ever-changing flow of mental experiences. It's like taking one part of your mind and looking at another, the part that has thoughts, perceptions, and feelings, following one after the other ceaselessly. They too move about, sometimes randomly, coming into existence, being with us for a moment, and then disintegrating. No different than our bodies. After contemplating your inner physical world in this way, now turn to the outer world. Slowly increase your awareness to include your immediate surroundings. Picture in your mind the seat you are on, the walls, the ceilings of your room, the space around you, and the objects filling it. Consider that each of these, although appearing solid and static, is actually a mass of tiny particles whizzing around. Try to allow yourself to see how active everything in your immediate surroundings actually is. Active in a very specific way, moving about, reproducing, dying and disintegrating. Try to stay with this experience for a few more breaths. Then we continue to expand our awareness of subtle impermanence to take in the house or building that you are in, trees, streets, people and animals, cars, cities, and mountains. Go as far as you like. Recall that each being or object you touch with your thoughts is, at a very subtle level, changing right now as each moment occurs now and moves to the next. Changing in every moment. Nothing remains the same. Try to affirm your experience of nothing remains the same from one moment to the next. Take a few breaths now and concentrate on this experience. If at any time during this meditation you have a clear, strong feeling of the ever-changing nature of things, hold your attention firmly on it for as long as possible. This is called stabilizing meditation. Soak your mind in the experience. When the feeling fades or your attention starts to wander, again analyze the impermanence of either your body, your mind, or another object. And we conclude the meditation with the thought, the affirmational thought, that it's unrealistic and self-defeating to cling, to grasp, to things as though they were permanent. Whatever is beautiful and pleasing will change and eventually disappear, like the flowers I mentioned earlier. So we can't expect it to give us lasting happiness. Momentary happiness, seen through the lens of the object's impermanence, yes, can be a very happy moment. Seen through that lens. And also, whatever is unpleasant or disturbing won't last forever. It might even change for the better. So this too has the same impermanent nature as pleasant arising moments. Have the clear experience that it will fade, it will disintegrate, it won't last forever. And to cling to it, therefore, is unwise. No need to be upset or to reject it. Simply allow it to come and go. It's impermanent. So we end our guided meditation now by bringing our focus back to our course level breath, moving in and out. Feel the rising and falling of your chest and abdomen as you inhale and exhale, and bring your awareness back to the room. And we dedicate the positive, virtuous energy and insights that we might have experienced during this meditation to not only our own happiness, but the happiness of all others. So that is one of the most common meditations in Mahayana Buddhism to help us work with having developing an awareness in our mind moment by moment of the impermanence of all things. That it shouldn't be something that is seen as dark or negative in any way, but rather allows one to have a sense of freedom, not being burdened by mistakenly being overly attached to all impermanent things, and rather to be able to experience them because they are impermanent with a sense of liberation, of freedom, peace, and happiness. So then this is also then, I feel if one works on the meditation with impermanence, and then you carry that into doing the 9 point meditation on death, it helps to experience the death meditation in the most positive way possible, both ending with infusing you with that sense of urgency to move forward in your spiritual practice, knowing that our precious human life is impermanent and everything's impermanent, all sentient beings, all phenomena, and our opportunity to practice is perishable, and we should get to it. And that's all part of like what we discovered in our first session. So that kind of gives us a wrap on our first session, extended into this session in the form of the recap and then also the actual meditation. And if we really develop pure renunciation, in Buddhism, we use this word a lot, realization. And that is supposed to be the result of taking the prescriptive medicine of doing the meditations. You should have a realization. It should be an experience, that not just an intellectual exercise, having read a book or understood the principles being taught and having some sort of feeling like, yeah, I like that. It should, you take it on, become the warrior, to take on the practice to end suffering, to take the path that could end suffering. Enter these meditative practices with that warrior mentality, with the courage to be present to an awareness of suffering existence, what its nature is, where it comes from, how it's present in our mind stream. And not only ours, but all sentient beings. If all sentient beings are impermanent, their nature coming from a similar previous moment of mind is logically the case. And one develops clarity of knowing that in one's mind stream. So that brings us to our focus on the next section. But let me just look quickly at the chat to see if there are some questions. Oh, I have to reload those files, I'm told, for anybody who joined after I put them up. And somebody did. Bill did. Thank you. Nice. Thank you, Bill. Um, okay, so I didn't know that. So that's good to know. Basically, what I'm rambling on about is that when I loaded these up before, only people who had already been in the session could access them, and then they had to be reloaded for people who joined afterwards. So that's a teaching in come to the session on time. So so now I'm going to move us to the next set of verses that talk about the second aspect of the path. Let me just bring that up here. Oh, sorry, I just clicked on the wrong button. So give me a moment. Sorry about that. Here we go. Okay. So through last session, we got through the first 5 verses that took us to where we just ended up. And the next session is section is actually a session on what we call developing the wish in our mind. Remember, we're always talking about what's in our mind to with the awareness that comes to us from the practice of renunciation, that clear knowing awareness of the true nature of suffering, the causes and conditions, Buddha's second noble truth, that we then want to be moved to do something about ending it, not just for ourselves, but for all sentient beings. And the next 3 verses, 6, 7, and 8, get at bringing to us through this very condensed um, form that Tsongkapa presents this practice. And it has 3 sections. The first section is you can see on the screen why you need the wish for enlightenment. And then the next section, which we'll get to, is how to go about developing the wish. And then the last one is how do you know when you finally developed it? And this is an essential cornerstone of the practice of Mahayana Buddhism. But even if you're not a Buddhist practitioner, then in my mind, as I've shared with many of you before, I was raised as a Roman Catholic. And ever since I become a Buddhist, um, the whole idea of what's called great compassion, which we'll talk about for a good portion of the rest of today and going into next week, um, is something that has caused me, for example, to turn and look at a figure like Jesus Christ and see that he had that. It 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 makes me have deep reverence and love and gratitude to Jesus. So even if one's not a practicing Buddhist, I encourage us to see the experience of developing what is called Bodhi mind, which you can see here in the verse on the screen. The benefit of that, no matter what path you decide to or are comfortable taking. His Holiness the Dalai Lama talks about that quite often, that even if you explore Buddhism, where you think it can help you, if you already have a spiritual practice you connect with, not just conceptually, but connect with, then you shouldn't forsake it. That it is a precious um, commodity to have in one's life. So I think that's worth mentioning. But here, I won't read all 3 versions of um, verse 6. I'll read the first The first, last week I read the first one. I'll read the third one this time. Renunciation, though, can never be the total bliss of matchless Buddhahood unless it's bound by the purest wish. And so the wise seek the highest wish for enlightenment. So here, Jason Kappa is telling us simply and clearly that okay, good that you have developed as you now have made a commitment to enter the path of spiritual practice to develop renunciation and to do your best to, based on an awareness of impermanence and death, to practice and knowledge of the Four Noble Truths, and that you have an untamed mind, to avoid non-virtuous activities of body, speech, and mind, which we talked about last session. I'll just show them to you quickly again. It's always worth looking at them. Let's just do that real quick. So the 10 non-virtuous um, activities here, they're of the nature of body, speech, and mind. Body, killing, stealing, sexual misconduct, speech, lying, divisive speech, harsh speech, pointless gossip. Mind, greed or covetousness, harmful intent, and wrong view, which is basically in its simplest form what it says parenthetically there, denial of cause and effect. And that's what we're looking at our practice of renunciation through that lens. And so then we make a resolve to practice in the place of these in our moment by moment arisings, working with taming our mind to be aware of whenever we're practicing non-virtue, to replace it with virtuous activities. And there's various meditations that we can do to develop these qualities. So through this lens, we look not only to do this for ourselves, but for all sentient beings. And that's the point that Jason Kopp is making here, is that if you don't conjoin renunciation with what is called here the highest wish for enlightenment, perfect supreme bodhicitta, in the second verse, pure Bodhi mind in the third, they're all the same. Then we can't. One can, and now I'm talking about something that's in Pabongka Rinpoche's commentary to this text that we're using. He talks about that one can only bring about an ordinary nirvana. So then this, like for me, when I first read this many, many years ago, I was like, well, then I don't get it, because in my mind, I didn't understand the difference between nirvana and and what Pabongka Rinpoche calls full enlightenment. So you might have the same question. So in today's talk, I wanted to mention that from a Buddhist point of view, one can do practices on the path to end one's at its root level and one's karmic ripenings, karmic strike that, and one's ongoing moment by moment taking on new seeds of karma, kleshas, they're called in Sanskrit. And this is like an amazing level of practice to reach. One can do this only by reaching the path of what's called the path of seeing in Buddhism. It's just seeing the true nature of all things directly. It's called seeing emptiness directly. So this is something, though, that's not considered. It's considered, to use a phrase, it's called lesser, lesser state of liberation. And actually, quite often in Mahayana Buddhism, you'll see the word liberation with an initial cap L referring to nirvana, that state that I just defined, as the state of liberation, versus going farther on the path to reach a state of enlightenment, which is synonymous with one reaching a state of Buddhahood. It's also synonymous in Vajrayana practice of what they call the path of no more learning. So then this is something to sort of underscore, and that if one wants to end suffering, and you have a clear and knowing experience of that, what it is, where it comes from, and you want to end it for yourself, then one can reach a path of nirvana or liberation. But if you clearly can see that that might be something that is experienced by every sentient being, and that's what causes all of suffering existence, then you might want to do something about it. Again, the word warrior comes in here because a warrior goes out and does something about it, whatever it is. Here, we're talking about suffering existence. So this verse is really just underscoring for us how that is a mantle one takes on specifically as a Mahayana Buddhist practitioner. It's called taking on the great scope, which it's the scope of not only wanting to reach liberation for oneself, but one wants to further liberate, be part of, leading like a warrior, like a skillful physician, prescribing for each sentient being through all of existence the right antidote for them to reach the same state of an end of suffering. It's a grand undertaking. And one is going, if one looks at that and likes the idea, then one has to follow further the verses that come to us after this verse 6 to see, well, okay, well, then how do we actually develop the wish for enlightenment? Because it starts first as a wish, meaning something that we plant in our mind stream that we go, we see that we want to attain it, but how do we go about doing it? And once we see it, it arises as a wish. And then it moves on from there. But next step is how to develop the wish for enlightenment. So here, this is contained actually in two verses, 7 and 8. So again, I'm going to be reading the third version of the verse here. They're swept along on the four fierce river currents, chained up tight in past deeds hard to undo, stuffed into a steel cage of grasping self, self is in quotes, smothered in the pitch black ignorance. Very poetic. And verse 8, in a limitless round, they are born. It's talking about sentient beings. And in their births are tortured by three sufferings without a break in every single moment. Think how your mothers feel. Think of what's happening to them. Try to develop this highest wish. So starting from the end, Tsongkapa is talking about the highest wish meaning. Seeing things with a clear, knowing, calm mind, one that's not untamed and running around wildly. We see the source that the suffering existence and its source, and that we take on the highest, again, that word highest, highest warrior, highest form of doing something about it, not just for yourself, but for all others. And Pabongka Rinpoche talks about this in a very pointed way in his book. For those of you who have the book, it's on pages 96 and 97. And he breaks down for us the meaning of the words in this verse 7 and verse 8. And they're worth paying attention to. So first, this wish is about benefiting all sentient beings, limitless. So this is something to keep in our minds as we contemplate and then meditate on these verses, and that we want to see them all as our mother. Our mother is an archetypical um, type of being that is all loving, unconditional love, and will do anything for those who are their children. So then these are two important aspects of what's appearing in these verses to get clear on. Um, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But he talks about these mothers being swept along the flow of the four river currents, all fierce suffering, very fierce suffering. So here, from Pabongka Rinpoche says, from one viewpoint, while they are acting as causes, remember, everything is causes and conditions ending in similar results, one of the laws of karma, right? So he says, when they're acting as causes, these can be identified as, and these are attached to the three poisons of ignorance, attachment, and aversion, and blossoming out of them our moment by moment experience of the 10 non-virtuous deeds. He calls them the torrent of desire, which is attached to one of the three poisons of attachment. Same thing, desire, attachment. The torrent of views, ignorance, one of the three poisons, seeing things delusionally, as His Holiness the Dalai Lama says. The torrents of the ripe force of deeds, taking actions in a way that manifest as us partaking in the 10 non-virtuous deeds on a regular basis. And the torrent of ignorance, which has to do with also specifically the non-virtuous deed of mind of having incorrect view, seeing things mistakenly. And then he articulates that these same four rivers in our contemplation and meditation should be clearly seen as then resulting in the four torrents of birth. Those activities result in the torrents of birth, aging, illness, and death. And that all mother beings are just hurtling along. It's very melodramatic, um, in these four great rivers. And it's done with this sort of intensity of poetic license to get a point, again, the urgency of how, if one can see this clear and knowingly, take on the mantle, the warrior mantle of being a bodhisattva, um, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then he says that their hands and feet are bound. So it's like karma is like intense. It's something that's there all the time. It's very tight. It's hard to sever. It's like fetters of iron. It's like being stuffed in a steel cage. And it's all comes from self-grasping because we mistakenly identify ourself and all phenomena as inherently self-existing. That's what it means by grasping self in quotes. Um, and there's even more. It's like he talks about it being like nighttime, like the darkest hour of night in pitch black. That's how hard it is to see things as they really are. Again, this is poetic. It's not meant to be literal, but it does get across the point of how hard it is to see things correctly, especially if, never mind since the beginning of this life, we might have been experiencing things in this mistaken, delusional way. But if you do subscribe to the Buddhist concept of the continuity of mind since beginningless time, then it could be pretty hard. That darkness could be pretty thick. It could be pretty smothering. So that's what they mean. He means also when he talks about a limitless round, or limit, they are born. It's talking about this presence. And as I mentioned in the beginning of my commentation to the commentary to death meditation, that this is something that um, when we're born in this life, we take on a gross consciousness, We take on a body that arises, exists, degrades, and goes out of existence. Both that gross level of mind of our mistakenly identifying our gross level self as being permanent. We continue, but not in that form. And then also our body, obviously. So the limitless realm. Um, and then so he says, this is what's happening. This is Pabongka Rinpoche. This is what's happening to our mothers. Again, remember, we're supposed to try to think of all sentient beings as being like our mother, and it's unbearable. Um, and that we have to take on being like a son or daughter, thinking about our mother, going through this kind of suffering. What the hell do we do? What do we do to help them? We have to find a way. So here's where the prescriptive meditations come in, associated with developing this, what's called bodhicitta, the wish to reach the Buddhahood or enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings. And it comes in the form of two types of training, meditation practices. We had two associated with renunciation, death and impermanence meditation. Um, and before that, just to make a sidebar comment, one is supposed to learn how to do meditation on this precious human life, um, and then followed by the two renunciation practices, and then followed by these two practices. These two practices are known as the seven-part cause and effect meditation practice. And the other one's called is exchanging self and others. So similar to the first two meditations associated with renunciation, one is pretty long. If you do it well, it has seven parts, not nine parts, but it has seven parts. And it actually has eight parts because it has a preliminary called, which you have to do. You have to build the seven-part cause and effect meditation on equanimity. So you first have to build that foundation, and then you could build your meditation practice of seven-part cause and effect on that. Then the other one is more direct and not as long. So next week we'll be doing a practice, meditation practice at the beginning on exchanging self and others. And then I'll explain what the seven-part cause and effect meditation is. We're not going to do it. That's something that we really can't, we don't have time to do in this short series. So I can start by talking a little bit about that now, meaning the seven-part cause and effect meditation practice and the parts that make it up, just to get a feel for it, just like I did earlier with the death meditation. But before I do that, I want to see if anybody has any questions. It's 10 after 11. We have 20 minutes. I don't want to short shrift any time that people might want to ask any questions. It's not required, but it's something that I want to stop here in case anybody has any questions. Amazing. I'm either talking gibberish or everything I'm saying is just so perfectly understandable that one can not possibly miss a beat. All right. So I will go ahead and take a few more minutes just to talk about the seven-part cause and effect. Sometimes it's known as a sevenfold cause and effect practice. Oh, wait, I see somebody on chat here. Um, okay. Somebody's actually asking, and somebody had asked me this during the week, where do you get the recordings if one wants to listen or re-listen to them? So DNKL has a YouTube channel, and the way to access it is you go to DNKL's website, and at the website, you'll see something, a pull down menu called teachings. And then under that, it says something about previous teachings. But maybe Chappelle knows this better than me. But essentially, you click on it and it will pop up a window that shows you previous teachings. And right there, because they're actually very recent, the one I did last week and then this one, they'll be right near the top. You just have to click on it, and then it will take you to the YouTube recording.
Hey, John.
Yeah, hi,
We,
Glory.
yeah, hi. We moved it under the tab called resources. So
Resources. There
in
you
the
go.
resource tab, you have previous teaching, you have a copy of our prayers, there's a library and prayer requests. So
There you go.
it's the first one listed there.
All right. So follow that, and you should be okay. Plus, I gave those handouts today that give you an overview, or give you the two death meditations. Shopal just put in the chat a link to that very place that Gloria described. You can go to by following the menu. Um, the resource menu. So here, though, I'll take a few minutes to talk about these two prescriptive medicinal antidotes to um, even if you've built renunciation. Jason Kappa tells us you cannot get anywhere further than possibly, at the very best, your own liberation. Remember, that's like lower nirvana, if you will, as I described earlier. And it has to be conjoined with, it actually has to be conjoined with both bodhicitta and the third principle, which we will get into in the second half of next week, and then on into the fourth week of this teaching, which will dive more deeply into that third aspect. So here, though, the seven-part cause and effect instruction actually, as I mentioned earlier, has 8 steps because it has to be built on a meditative practice that you get clarity on in your mind of equanimity, having equanimity for all sentient beings. I pause because I mean that literally. If you do the meditation or are familiar with it, which we're not going to be doing that in this series, I certainly can provide you with one if you're interested. But it's really, really, really important. We cannot go out into the world, never mind on our meditation cushion. Let me say that in reverse. We can't go on our meditation cushion, never mind out into the world, without having equanimity in our heart. I do a Tuesday night class where I teach a little bit about each week about the Buddha, about Master Shantideva's 6 perfection teaching and meditations associated with them. And in that, I've been doing this meditation practice. And in it, I always end each one of the parts by talking about how you know you have gotten to a certain level of practice with it when you can. And then the best version of that is when you, even when you're not in meditation, you instantly are in the moment, no matter what's facing you, no matter what is dependently arising because of your karmic ripenings. You do not feel anything except equanimity towards all sentient beings, especially the ones you're interacting with in the moment. It is so important, especially in the world we live in today. It is so important. Anything else will cloud your mind with further suffering. So that's my editorial comment. But that's how important and helpful a practice like this can be. This isn't just to reach enlightenment, although to put it that way sounds foolish, just to reach enlightenment. It can be, in addition to that, very beneficial to every moment we are here in this impermanent state. So the thing to know about them, I'm going to rattle them off and just give you a quick snapshot of each. But the first 3, built on the platform of equanimity, which we can think of as the preamble to it, the first 3 are the actual causes, the causes of the 4th and 5th steps. In the 4th and 5th steps, you'll see when I rattle them off what they are. Like you can develop what is the 4th and 5th state. We're talking about in your heart, in your mind, and that those in turn cause the result of what are the last 2 parts. So the first 3 parts are the meditation on seeing all beings as having been our mothers, which is just we talked about in verses 7 and 8. This is directly connected to those verses. And then once we're able to see them, you can see why practicing equanimity is really important. How could we possibly do the first part without that as a foundation? Then we want to recall their kindness. We want to repay their kindness. That's number three. And those are the cause for number four and five, which is loving kindness and compassion. And in their ultimate form, Pabongka Rinpoche in his text talks about it in a very eloquent way. And we might call it ultimate or great compassion. We might call it um, um, beautiful, perfect love, loving kindness. And those two in turn cause the ripening in our mind, the result in our mind to do the meditations on part 6 and 7 and actually experience them, have the realizations of them, which is to have great resolve. The great resolve to do what? Uh, to benefit all sentient beings um, in the way that we've been talking about. And in having that resolve actually arise in your mind, you're then moved to take on the wish with an intensity. They talk about it being and it's not an ordinary wanting to help people, but you want to help them in the ultimate way, which is to end their suffering forever, forever. So then again, um, we talked already about how equanimity is the most important thing to build this kind of practice on. And then just to circle back and do a snapshot for you in a little bit more focused way on each one of these parts. The first part, seeing all beings as having been our mother. So this is like the first part. And so this meditation is we and remember, we're looking at this through a Buddhist context of mothers, as I described, all having either from a Buddhist point of view been our mothers, like literally many times over, it's taught in the Buddhist teachings since beginningless time. Beginningless time is a long time. So that's actually possible. But we don't even have to accept that. We could say just even in this life, just work with the archetypical principle of a mother and hold that in your mind, that unconditional love for their child. Then it becomes clear in this meditation that we have to feel a sense of deep awareness and clear knowing that if I could experience either literally within a Buddhist frame of reference or like in the archetypical sense, just even in this lifetime, if I could visualize, first starting with using your imagination, but then taking it to heart through these meditation practices, um, that I experience all sentient beings as my mother. Wow, that is a good place to start to cure the ills of the world, starting with ourselves. The second part is actually taking time out now to recall their kindness, what they've done for me unconditionally. Um, it just is it's unbelievable. If you think about what a mother does unconditionally for their child, and if that could extend to all sentient beings, um, that would be amazing. And and accepting that and seeing all sentient beings as our mothers, we can have so much feeling of kindness and gratitude towards them. And that leads us to the third one, which is repaying, paying them back for their kindness. Um, Based on that true feeling of clear, knowing gratitude for their kindness, it's like you're moved. The realization is like, how how could I how could I possibly repay you? I couldn't do enough to repay you. Think about that. Hope maybe you can relate to that either with your own mother, if not, because that's an archetypical mother. Maybe there's someone else in your life, your your spouse, your father, your aunt, your uncle, somebody close to you, a brother, sister, and then utilize that, expand that to include all sentient beings. And again, I talked about those three being the cause for then the fourth one, which is love. This one deserves some attention because there are different levels of love. And what do I mean by that? There's really different kinds of love. There's the kind that's endearing and heartwarming, and it arises naturally, like a parent to a child. Um, and then there's also this one we've been talking about, wishing sentient beings to have happiness, but not necessarily all sentient beings. But we expand it to that. That's one of the focus purposes of this kind of love. And a deeper, more um, reliable type of happiness is that which arises not just moment by moment, randomly, in the uncontrolled, untamed mind, but one that is done through having developed, gone into the jungle of the mind and tamed it. So, by developing purposely and skillfully positive states of mind, one can have a pervasive presence of this deep appreciation for all sentient beings. And that becomes more and more, I'll use a word, sublime, experientially, as one develops this. All I could do is describe it as being like a blissful feeling towards all sentient beings that comes from this kind of mental concentration and calm abiding in that object of meditation. I'm just trying to encourage you guys, obviously, to do these meditations. Don't put them off if you have any inkling it might be beneficial to you. And once they arise, they should be present to you all the time. Maybe not literally every second, but they can permeate your mind stream 24/7, even when you're asleep, and be creating virtuous um, clarity and peace and joy and happiness that last. Um, so doing this kind of meditation eventually ends up in the deepest form of love, which is this wish to give loving kindness to all sentient beings and to end uh, the causes that prevent them from taking on these virtuous states of mind that you develop in this kind of practice. So that's something you want to experience here and now. This isn't about reaching enlightenment only. This is about where do you start and how it could benefit you now. That's so, 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 so important. And then that leads to sort of the bookend to love or loving kindness, and that's compassion. And in its ultimate form, holding again those three causes, the first three parts in your mind, and then the love that it causes you to feel on top of wanting to repay them. Then that love comes, then the compassion comes, because then not only do you want to give them every happiness, you want to also the bookend end their suffering, knowing that that's the way to having them attain any kind of lasting happiness. It has to go together with loving kindness. There's no other way. There's no other, they're bookends, they're conjoined. It goes back to the verse of like, you can have renunciation, but you must have these qualities. So I could say a lot more about it, but because of time, I won't. And then this leads to the final two. And this gets to the third part of what Pabongka Rinpoche talks about in his text, um, which is that how do you know when you finally develop the wish for enlightenment? Then this is what occurs, manifest in step 6 and 7 of the 7-part meditation. You can't help but have arise in you, um, built on those three first part causes, and then the resulting loving kindness, profound loving kindness and compassion. You can't help but then have that sense of repaying with that deep love and compassion of having unshakable, unshakable resolve Now you become the warrior. You take the first steps in becoming the warrior, that most high form of being a warrior, a bodhisattva warrior. And you say, I myself will do whatever it takes to give happiness to all sentient beings and free them from suffering forever. And that is something that's a realization. It's very, very intense and strong. Um, and then the seventh step comes naturally from that, which is that built on that great resolve. You want to then take what we call the king's way. The king's way is you get on the rest of the path. You do whatever practices are available to you as an antidote to end your own suffering so that you can reach the path of enlightenment. So once one reaches that path in that form, not just in an ordinary form, we might each all do wonderful things, and hopefully we do in our day-to-day existence for others, infused with this kind of love and compassion. But the most skillful, the most wisdom-filled way is to do it in the form of enlightenment, because in that form you can benefit all sentient beings throughout all of existence. There's nothing more that you can do. That's why it's called the King's Way. You go to enlightenment, but not for yourself, but for all sentient beings, knowing that if you reach that state, this can be the end result. So this is like what happens. All this that I talked about for the past 45 minutes after our meditation in Tsongkapa's verses 6, 7, and 8. And those three verses, this is all that's what's unfolding. There's a pattern. It's not rocket science. It's understanding what the verses are telling you about the nature of things, built on Buddha's first noble truth, exploring, examining where the causes and conditions come from. Then we learn and study how that comes about in our mind stream, especially built on delusions and karma. And then that moves us forward into what we talked about and discussed today. And then next week, we'll do a meditation on exchanging self and other, which are one of the two practices that are prescriptively given here. And then from there, we'll move into discussion of the final of the three principal aspects of the path, which is we'll do a full exploration. I'll give some extra time, meaning the second half of next week, and then all of the fourth session on talking about developing the wisdom of emptiness. Um, and the flip side of that coin, which is dependent arising, and seeing how they are one and the same. And so this is the end of today. We're at 11:31. And even though we're out of time, I just want to see if there are any other questions. There's a hand raised by Shilpa.
So, John, somebody here is asking, what is the definition of love in this sense?
A definition of love. Hear this clearly, if you will, because it's like people sometimes leave it in the dust in Buddhism, when we talk about compassion being the bookend to wisdom. But it is the bookend to compassion. Love is taking action of body, speech, and mind that wants to give every happiness, every positive attribute and quality to others. Pause. The bookend of that is compassion, which is you want to purposely, in every way, end suffering of all sentient beings. They go together, right? They're bookends. And that's the simplest way I can describe them in that love. In the context of what we just talked about, the seven-part cause and effect practice, that is the only way to describe it. It's a bookend to compassion. They go together. They're a one-two punch. You really don't want. And I always, in my mind, can join them. And they are taught by Tsongkapa in our school that they're the result of the first three parts built on equanimity of the 7-part cause and effect meditation, and they always go together. They flow right out of it together. So I don't know if that's satisfactory, Chopal, but that's the best I can do, I think.
Hold on, let me unmute it. You can just speak loudly.
Okay. Yeah, one of my questions was, you mentioned a definition of love, and did the Buddha ever give a definition of love? And could you mention also about different levels? Is that of love, if I understood you correctly? So I was understanding, where does that information come from? Does that come from the Buddha? Does that come from any sacred texts?
Yeah, they do come from the I don't have them in my mind. I don't have them available to me. I have the text here. It comes from the Pali canon. And so what I can do for you is give you quotes in that regard, and provide that to you for next session, and I'll share them with everyone. But the characteristics of the different types of love, if you will, I call them types. The Buddha doesn't use that word, that I quickly ran through. I could take much more time with, but we ran out of time today. They are in the Buddha's own teachings that are present in the Pali canon.
Thank you.
Okay. Let's see if anybody else has a question here. Bill is asking me, can you share your email again, please? Email is my email address. I'll put it in it's J Cerullo, number 13, or J Cerullo 13 at gmail.com. And I just sent that to everybody even though we're going to be hanging up. So at least I said, so it's jcerullo13 at gmail.com. And anybody could feel free to, touch base with me at any time. I think most people who know me for a long time know that I like hearing from people. Maybe there's a question you have that you don't feel comfortable asking in a group, that kind of thing. Or you just want to chat about a topic a little bit more detail. I love the opportunity to do that. So please feel free to contact me in that regard. So any other questions? I'll end by just saying, if you haven't, people are saying thank you on the chat. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. If you haven't listened to the first session, highly recommend it, because frankly, I spent much more time on renunciation because it's the most misunderstood. And I'm always happy to circle back and talk a little bit more about that if anything was fuzzy in that presentation. But I try to make it relatable to now. And oh, did I send the wrong email address? Oh, I put oh, geez, terrible. I left out the G. I can't type when I'm talking. It's jcerullo13 at Gmail. I left off the G in what I just said. Thanks, Chopal. I'm really bad at doing more than one thing at a time. Although I'm supposed to be able to do more than one thing at a time, because I have a Gemini ascendant in my astrological chart, which is a sign of the twins, and you're supposed to be able to do lots of things at once, but I was never very good at that. Anyway, now I am rambling, so let's end it for today, and I thank you all for coming. Hopefully I see you next week. We'll dive into we'll do the meditation. We'll dive into the practice of understanding and exploring emptiness. Yay, my favorite topic.
Thank you so much, John.
Thank you.
Take care.
Okay, take care. Bye-bye, everybody.
You.